Montana Territory, September 1873. The train hissed as it slowed into the dusty platform of Elkhorn Station, and by the time the last car settled with a groan, Susanna Adair knew she was being sent back. She gripped the handle of her carpet bag tighter, her knuckles white beneath worn gloves. Her cheeks still burned from the quiet, polite rejection she had received in Butte just a day before. "She's not what we're looking for," the woman had said, with a tight-lipped smile and eyes that flicked down her face and then away, as if ashamed to look too long. "The family requires someone refined and pleasant to look at," which meant beautiful, which Susanna had never been. Not in the way that counted in places like Butte, where the widows wore silk and their children still had fathers. She had come with good references, a straight back, and a heart ready to work. All of it had meant nothing. The train door banged open. She stepped down into the dirt with a quiet breath and her head held high. There was no one to meet her. She had no choice but to start walking. The town of Elkhorn was small, the kind of place where people noticed when a stranger walked by. She passed a feed store, a saloon with its doors flung open to the early evening sun, and a livery where a tall man in a blue shirt was brushing down a chestnut mare. He looked up, just for a second, and then he saw her laugh. It was not a loud laugh, just a soft one that escaped when a little boy, maybe 7 or 8, ran past her chasing a chicken. The bird darted under her skirt, flapping madly, and she jumped back with a surprised sound that bubbled into a laugh before she could stop it. That was the moment he fell in love. He did not know that yet, but something inside him shifted. He stepped out from the livery, brushing his hands on his trousers. "Miss," Susanna slowed. "Yes, you all right?" "I am." She glanced around. "Just back, that's all." "Back," she nodded. "They sent me home." He tilted his head like he was trying to understand something more than what she said. "Well, you just got here, far as I see it." She stared at him. He had a kind face, strong jaw, sun-browned skin, eyes the color of wet earth. "What's your name?" "Roan Thatcher," he said. "I work the Thatcher Ranch north of town." "I'm Susanna Adair." He motioned to her bag. "You got somewhere to stay?" "No," she said, "but I have a little money. I'll find a room." Roan looked at her another long moment, not in the way the ladies in Butte had, not measuring or dismissing. "Just seeing. My sister runs the boarding house," he said. "She's got an extra room. I'll walk you." She hesitated, her pride prickling, but she was tired, and he seemed honest. "All right." They walked in silence for a while, past the smithy and the quiet storefronts, until the sun dipped just low enough to set the town in gold. His stride was long, steady. He did not ask why she had been sent back, and she was grateful for that. The boarding house sat on a corner lot with a whitewashed porch and a garden nearly gone to frost. Roan knocked, and a woman in her 30s opened the door with a toddler on her hip. "This is my sister Clara," Roan said. "Clara, this is Miss Adair. She needs a room." Clara smiled kindly. "Well, we have one. Come in." The room was small but clean, with a quilt on the bed and a window that faced the mountains. Susanna set down her bag and sat on the edge of the mattress. Later, she came downstairs for supper, and Roan was still there, seated at the table with Clara's husband and their 2 children. He rose when she entered. "Sit," Clara said with a warm smile. "Your family now." That night, after the dishes were done and the children put to bed, Roan offered to walk her out to the porch. The night was cool. The stars above the mountains looked endless. "You going to stay long?" he asked. "I do not know," she said. "If I can find work, maybe." "What kind of work?" "Housekeeping, teaching, anything honest," he nodded. "You will," she traced the edge of the porch railing with her fingers. "You do not have to be kind to me, Mr. Thatcher." He looked at her, steady and true. "I am not being kind. I am being real." She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her chest loosened. "You are strange for a cowboy," he smiled. "You are strange for a woman who just got sent back." They both laughed. The next morning, Susanna found a notice tacked to the church board, an elderly couple looking for someone to help around the house. She took the job. The work was hard but fair. She moved through the days with quiet efficiency, and every evening, Roan found a reason to stop by the boarding house. Sometimes he brought Clara a sack of flour. Sometimes he just stood on the porch and talked to Susanna until the stars came out. She asked him once, "Why are you always here?" And he said, "Because you laugh like nothing in the world ever hurt you." She stared at him, heart-thudding. "But I have been hurt," he nodded. "I know, that is why it matters." The days went on. One afternoon, as September turned to October, Susanna was walking home from the elderly couple's house when she heard shouting near the edge of town. She ran toward it and found a wagon overturned in the ditch, a man pinned beneath it, groaning, and a little girl, maybe 5, crying beside it. Susanna dropped to her knees. "Are you hurt?" The girl shook her head through tears. "My papa, he is stuck. Susanna did not hesitate. She grabbed the girl and pulled her back. "Stay here." Then she ran. She ran faster than she had in her life, straight to the livery where she knew Roan would be. He was saddling a horse when she burst in. "There is a man trapped under a wagon near the south road. A little girl, please." He was already moving. By the time they reached the ditch, others had come too. Roan and 2 other men lifted the wagon just enough to pull the man free. He was breathing, barely. Someone ran to fetch the doctor. The little girl clung to Susanna's skirt, sobbing. She held her close, her hands gentle in the child's hair. Later, Roan helped her onto his horse to ride back to town. She rode side saddle in front of him, his arm steady behind her. She felt safe. She felt like she belonged. That night, as they stood again on the porch, he touched her sleeve. "You are not what they said you were." She looked up at him. "What do you mean? They said you were not beautiful." She looked down. "I know." He reached for her hand. "They were wrong." She opened her mouth, but no words came. "I saw you laugh," he said, "and I have not stopped thinking about you since." The wind stirred her hair. The porch creaked beneath their feet. "I think I am falling for you, Susanna Adair," he said. She took a breath. "Then I think I am falling too." And under the Montana stars, he pulled her into his arms, and she did not pull away. By mid-October, frost clung to the porch railings each morning, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Susanna had begun wearing a shawl over her shoulders as she walked to and from her work. Her hands had cracked from the scrubbing and mending, but she didn't mind. The work steadied her thoughts. On Sundays, she joined Clara and her family at the church at the end of Main Street. The congregation was small and the pews uneven, but the hymns rose strong and pure above the worn floorboards. Roan always came in late, hat in hand, and sat in the back with his head bowed like he didn't quite belong there. But when the service ended, he always waited outside, and they'd walk along the creek behind the church together, the air quiet around them. This Sunday the creek ran low, the water moving slow between polished stones. Susanna walked beside him, her boots brushing yellowed grass, her fingers worrying a fray in her glove. "You ever think of leaving Montana?" Roan asked, his voice soft with thought, not doubt. "No," she said. "I've had enough of starting over." He nodded, his eyes on the horizon where the hills rolled dark and steady. "What would you have done if things had gone different?" "I don't know," she said after a pause. "Maybe had a home with a garden, a place with quiet corners." "Children," he looked at her then, something unreadable in his gaze. "You still could, you know." She stopped walking. "That's not for me now." "Why not?" She turned toward the water, her voice low. "Some things pass you by, you don't chase them down. You just learn to live without." Roan didn't answer right away. When he did, it was with care. "I think whoever told you that was wrong." She didn't say anything, but she didn't walk away either. The next day, when she arrived at the Jenkins homestead, Mrs. Jenkins met her at the door with a letter. "This came for you," the woman said, handing it over with a look of restrained curiosity. Susanna didn't open it until she was alone, seated on the back stoop with the sun warming her skirt. The handwriting was unfamiliar sharp, neat loops crowded close together. The letter was from a school board in Deer Lodge. Her name had been passed along by a preacher she'd met in Butte. They needed a teacher for the winter term, someone unmarried, respectable, firm with young boys. The pay was modest, but the position would include room and board. She read the letter twice, her mouth dry. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. That evening, as she peeled apples at Clara's kitchen table, she said nothing. But Roan came in late, cheeks red from the wind, and paused when he saw her. "Everything all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Just thinking." He watched her for a moment, then crossed the room for the kettle. "What about?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was even. "Dear Lodge needs a schoolteacher." He poured the water into a cup. "And you'd go?" "I haven't decided." He leaned against the doorframe. "What's holding you back?" She sliced another apple, her fingers steady. "I don't know if I want to leave what I'm building here." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "You mean the job?" Her knife paused. "No." Clara came in with the children before either of them could say more, and the moment passed. 3 days later, Roan found her in the alley behind the mercantile, struggling with a sack of flour that had split near the bottom. She was kneeling, trying to gather the spill into her apron. "You need help?" he asked, already crouching beside her. "I've got it," she said, but her cheeks were flushed and her mouth tight. They worked in silence, scooping what they could. When the worst was over, he brushed the dust from his hands and looked at her. "Did you ever learn to ride proper?" She glanced at him, puzzled. "Side saddle when I was a girl," he shook his head. "I mean real riding. You'd be better off knowing if you're going to Deer Lodge." She hesitated. "I haven't decided." He stepped back, giving her space. "Then come out to the ranch tomorrow." "I'll show you." She looked down at her apron, now heavy with flour. "I'd need to ask Clara. She'll say yes." She did. The next afternoon, Susanna rode out with Roan in a borrowed wagon, the road stretching wide under an open sky. The ranch was quiet when they arrived, the fields golden and the fences long. Roan saddled an older gelding with a calm eye and a slow gait. "You can ride him bareback if you're feeling brave," he said. "I'm not," she replied, climbing into the saddle with careful hands. He led them out to the edge of the pasture where the land sloped gently down toward a stand of cottonwoods. She followed his instructions, awkward at first but steadier as the minutes passed. "You're leaning too far back," he called. "Trust your legs." "Let the horse do the work." She corrected her posture, jaw tight with focus. "Better," he said, riding up beside her. "You listen well. I like learning things that matter." He looked over at her, his expression unreadable again. "So do I." They rode until the sun dipped low and the air cooled. As they turned back toward the barn, she asked, "Did you always want this life?" He considered. "I never thought much about what I wanted. I just did the work in front of me." She nodded. "It's a good way to live." He glanced at her, "but not always enough." She met his gaze. "No. Not always." Back at the barn, he helped her down. Her foot caught slightly and she landed closer to him than she meant to. His hands steadied her waist. Neither of them moved. "Susanna," he said very quietly, "I want something more." She drew in a breath, her heart loud in her chest. "So do I." He let her go gently, like he was afraid to startle something fragile. That night, she opened the letter from Deer Lodge again, read it once more, and tucked it back without deciding, because something was changing, and she wasn't sure yet which way her heart would carry her. By late October, the ground had begun to harden overnight. Wood piles grew taller behind houses, and the air each morning held a silver edge that lingered even after the sun climbed. The cottonwoods along the creek had lost most of their leaves, leaving sharp silhouettes against the pale sky. Susanna had begun rising earlier to help Clara with the washing before her hours at the Jenkins place. She no longer felt like someone passing through. The rhythm of life in Elkhorn had settled around her, quiet and steady, like the hills that hemmed the valley. On a Tuesday morning, Roan came to the boarding house with a letter in his hand, the envelope creased and mottled with fingerprints. He waited until Clara stepped out with the baby, then held it toward Susanna. "My father wrote from Wyoming Territory. He's taken sick." She looked at the letter but didn't take it. "Is it bad?" He didn't say it plain, but if he's writing, it isn't good. Her eyes searched his face. "You'll go," he nodded once. "I have to. He's alone out there." She didn't ask how long he'd be gone. She didn't need to. That evening, she helped Clara trim lamp wicks while the children played on the floor. Roan stood by the stove, his hands in his pockets, eyes distant. Later, when the house was quiet, he stepped out onto the porch and waited. She joined him after a long moment, folding her arms against the cold. "I'll ride out at first light," he said. She nodded. "I figured." He hesitated, then looked at her. "I've never left anything behind that I didn't expect to find changed when I came back." She kept her gaze on the dark ridge beyond town. And you expect this will? I don't know what I expect. His voice was low, but I'd like to think some things stay. The wind rustled the dry grass along the fence. She turned toward him. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He reached for her hand, rough fingers closing around hers. I don't have a promise to give you yet, but I meant what I said. I want more. Her voice caught slightly. So do I. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead lightly to hers. Wait for me. She closed her eyes. I will. At dawn, he rode out with a bedroll and a pack of dried meat, the sky pale pink behind him. She stood on the porch until the dust of his horse faded down the road. The days that followed moved without hurry. She scrubbed linens, clipped herbs for Mrs. Jenkins, and joined Clara at the church circle on Thursdays. She didn't mention the letter from Deer Lodge again, and when Clara asked, "Have you made a decision yet?" she only said, "Not quite." A week passed, then another. One afternoon, Susanna walked to the post office to collect a parcel for the Jenkinses. On her way back, she passed the livery and paused, pressing a hand to the warm flank of a bay mare she didn't recognize. The stable boy looked up from sweeping. That one came in from the north, he said. Courier out of Helena. Brought a bundle for your Mr. Thatcher, she blinked. Roan, he nodded, left it with his sister. She found Clara in the kitchen, wiping flour from the edge of the table. A courier came, Clara wiped her hands on her apron. He did. Gave me this. She handed over a folded paper with Roan's handwriting across the front. Her heart thudded once, hard. She carried it to her room and sat on the edge of the bed before opening it. He wrote simply. His father's condition had worsened. The fever had left him weak, and Roan had stayed to work the land through the first frost. But the letter wasn't long. It ended with, I think of you when the sun drops behind the hills. That quiet. That sure. She folded it carefully, placed it under her pillow. The next morning, she brought it with her to the Jenkins and read it aloud to Mrs. Jenkins when the woman asked after Roan. The old woman nodded once, then said, He's the kind that comes back. By the end of November, snow brushed the tops of the mountains. The town prepared for winter with quiet urgency. Chimneys swept, horses blanketed, windows patched against the cold. Roan returned on the first morning of December. The town was still, smoke curling from rooftops, when Susanna stepped onto the porch and saw him leading his horse down the street. He looked thinner, his coat heavy with dust, but his pace was steady. She walked down the steps and stopped at the gate. He met her there, took off his hat, and looked at her without speaking. She reached up, touched the edge of his collar, then stepped into his arms. He held her tightly, like something fought for and found. After a long moment, he pulled back just enough to look at her. I told my father about you. She blinked at the sudden warmth rising behind her eyes. What did you tell him? That I found someone worth staying for. She let out a breath, quiet and full. He touched her cheek. I want to build something here, not just land, a life, with you. Her hands found his coat, fingers curling into the wool. I'm not going to Deer Lodge. I hope not. She leaned her forehead into his chest. You took your time. I needed to be sure I'd come back to the right place. They stood there as the snow began to fall, soft, slow flakes that melted in her hair. She tilted her face up, eyes bright. You still think I laugh like nothing ever hurt me, he smiled gently. No, I think you laugh like someone who knows hurt and chooses joy anyway. She reached for his hand, and he laced his fingers through hers. Behind them, the boarding house door creaked open and Clara's boy called out, laughing as he tumbled into the snow. Roan looked down at Susanna. How do you feel about gardens? I've always wanted one, he nodded once. Let's build one. Come spring, and she whispered, yes. By late December, the snow had settled into thick crusts along the rooftops and fence rails, and the days shortened into swift, gray afternoons. Fires burned longer, and the streets of Elkhorn quieted earlier, the cold pressing in like a held breath. Susanna rose before dawn now, lighting the stove in the boarding house kitchen while Clara nursed the baby in the next room. She'd taken to helping with the morning meal, her hands practiced and sure, the rhythm of each morning as familiar as the grain of the wooden table beneath her palms. She found it comforting, this quiet usefulness that didn't ask her to be anything but steady. Roan started coming in from the Thatcher ranch every third day, sometimes with a brace of quail, sometimes with nothing but the smell of pine on his coat. The work there was slower in winter, but not idle. Fences still needed mending, and the livestock had to be checked twice daily. One crisp morning, Susanna waited beside the stable while he tightened the saddle girth on his gelding. She wore a wool scarf tucked into her coat, her eyes following the breath that rose from the horse's nose in soft, steady bursts. "You ever wonder what it'd be like to live in a place with no winter?" he asked. She tilted her head. "I'd miss the way the world quiets." "Snow makes everything seem like it's holding its breath." He nodded once, then pulled himself into the saddle. "We're clearing brush near the creek tomorrow. You could come." "For what?" He smiled slightly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I could use someone to keep me from rolling an ankle." She looked at him with one brow raised. "You want me for company?" He didn't deny it. "That too." They set out early the next morning, bundled against the wind. The ranch land rolled wide and white beneath a sky the color of pewter. They rode to the edge of the creek where last summer's floods had pushed deadwood across the low banks. Roan handed her a pair of worn gloves, too big in the fingers, and showed her how to pull the branches free without cracking them in two. "I used to do this with my brother," he said, lifting a long limb and tossing it aside. "I didn't know you had one," he nodded, his mouth tightening. "Nathan died at 19, took a spill breaking a horse, broke his neck clean." She looked at him, not with pity, but with understanding. "I had a younger sister, typhoid." He leaned on the handle of his hatchet, eyes on the frozen creek. "You think about her still?" "Every time I see a blue ribbon," she said. "She used to tie them to the barn cats." Roan worked in silence after that, his movements calm and methodical. She followed suit, the cold biting at her cheeks. They paused once to eat the bread and dried apples Clara had packed in a cloth. He watched her from across the log where they sat, and she could feel the weight of his gaze, not pressing, just present. "You still want a garden?" he asked. She nodded. "I've already picked the corner behind Clara's henhouse. Gets good sun. You planning to stay there?" "For now." He looked down at his gloves. "I've been thinking about building a cabin." Her heart beat once, hard, then settled. "Where?" He pointed south past the tree line. "On the ridge above the pasture. Land's mine. Been saving the lumber from old fence rails." "And you want to build it alone?" "No." He looked up, steady and quiet. "I want to build it for us." She held his gaze for a long moment. "You sure?" "I've been sure since you laughed on that street." She drew in a slow breath, the cold stinging her lungs. "Then I'll help you build it." They finished the clearing with fingers stiff and breath fogging in the air. He walked her back to the boarding house, their boots crunching over packed snow. Before she stepped inside, she touched his arm. "Do you want to come in?" His answer was immediate. Yes. Clara had already gone upstairs with the children, the lamp in the sitting room dimmed low. Susanna poured them each a cup of strong tea left warming on the stove. Roan didn't sit. He stood beside the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel, as if unsure where to put the fullness of the moment. She joined him there, the firelight casting flickers up the lines of his face. "I never thought I'd have this again," she said softly. "Have what?" "Someone to stand beside." He reached for her hand, his thumb running once across the back of it. "Then let's not waste it." She stepped closer, her voice barely above a breath. "I'm not afraid anymore." He leaned in, forehead to hers, the firelight warming their shadows against the wall. "Neither am I." They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. And when he left, it was only to return the next morning with nails, 2 hammers, and a sack of seed catalogs wrapped in oilcloth. Christmas morning came clear and bitter. The sky a pale wash of color behind the hills, and the valley wrapped in stillness. Roan arrived early, coat dusted with frost, arms full of cedar boughs and dried oranges strung on twine. Clara opened the door with her apron dusted in flour and a quiet smile as she stepped aside to let him in. He found Susanna in the kitchen, sleeves rolled as she pressed dough into a tin. Her hair had slipped from its pins, a loose strand curling at her cheek. She looked up and stilled when she saw him. "These are for you," he said, holding out the bundle. She took the garland in her hands, the dried fruit soft with color against the green. "It smells like the mountains." "I gathered them just beyond the ridge," he said. "The snow there's knee-deep already." She set the garland on the table, then met his eyes. "You didn't need to bring anything, I know. But I wanted to." They spent the morning with Clara's family, the children tearing into their small gifts: a carved whistle, a new pair of mittens, a rag doll stitched with careful care. Susanna had sewn each stitch of the doll's dress by lamplight, and when Clara's daughter hugged it to her chest, Susanna had to look away for a moment. After the meal, Roan offered to walk her to the churchyard. She agreed without hesitation, wrapping her shawl tighter and pulling on her boots. The snow crunched beneath them as they walked, the town hushed around them. The church stood quiet, its windows catching the late sun. They wandered through the graveyard, the headstones softened by snow. Susanna paused beside a small marker near the back, the name long worn from the stone. She didn't speak, but Roan waited beside her, not asking. After a long silence, she said, "It's not hers, my sister's. I just needed a place." He nodded, his breath visible in the cold. "I've done the same." She turned toward him. "Do you ever feel like you've lived two lives? The one before and this one?" He looked at her, his voice low. "I think I didn't start living until you came off that train." She looked down, snow clinging to the hem of her skirt. "I used to believe I'd finish my days alone. That I'd made peace with it. You don't have to." She looked up again, and this time her eyes didn't carry hesitation. "I know that now." They walked back as evening settled, the sun dropping behind the western hills. When they reached the boarding house, he paused at the steps. "I've got something else," he said, "but it's not wrapped." She arched a brow at him. "Should I be nervous?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. She opened it slowly, her breath catching as she read the top line. "Land deed transfer parcel West Ridge Roan Thatcher to Susanna Adair." She stared at it, then looked up at him. I want it to be yours too," he said. "Not just something I built for you, something we own together." Her hand trembled slightly as she held the paper. "You mean to stay? There's nothing better waiting elsewhere. I've got room in my life for you, Susanna, and I want to fill every corner." She stepped forward, slipping the paper back into his hand. "Then let's start building." They didn't speak further, they didn't need to. She leaned into him, and his arms came around her like they were made to. The porch light flickered behind them, the scent of pine still clinging to his coat. She closed her eyes and breathed it in. The weeks that followed were full. Roan brought lumber in by sled from a mill outside Virginia City, and Susanna sketched the layout of their cabin on the back of a feed ledger. She chose where the windows would go, how the hearth would face east to catch the morning light. In February, they held a quiet ceremony in the church, with Clara's baby fussing in the pew and the preacher's voice echoing off the plank walls. Susanna wore a dress the color of winter wheat, and Roan stood beside her in his best wool coat, his hand steady in hers. There were no grand declarations, just the joining of two people who had already chosen each other long before any words were spoken. They moved into the cabin in early March when the thaw began and the earth softened enough to press seeds into. Roan built shelves by hand, and Susanna filled them with jars of dried herbs and the little books she'd carried with her from Kentucky. She planted sweet peas against the southern wall and hung her sister's ribbon in the window. One morning, as she stood on the porch sipping coffee, she watched Roan move across the field with a bucket in each hand, the sunrise casting his figure long across the grass. He looked up and saw her and lifted one hand in greeting. She raised hers in return. When he reached her, he set the buckets down and kissed her cheek, the warmth of his breath brushing her skin. "Spring's near," he said. She nodded. "I think we'll have tomatoes by June." He leaned against the post beside her, watching the sky, and maybe more. She looked at him, brows lifted. "I saw Clara yesterday," he said. "She thinks you glow." Susanna laughed, the sound low and full. "You asked Clara?" "I asked because I wanted to know if we ought to build that cradle now or later." She smiled, her hand settling just below her ribs. "Now would be just fine." He looked at her then, eyes full of something deeper than joy. "Then we'll start tonight." The wind stirred the grass, and in the distance, the creek moved with the sound of meltwater. The land was waking again, and with it, the life they'd made. At dusk, they sat together on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. The fire smoked gently in the hearth behind them, and the stars began to prick the sky one by one. No words passed between them, none needed. In the quiet, in the closeness, in the stillness of that moment, everything they had hoped for, everything they had survived came to rest. And it was enough.